We return to our coverage of the Mueller report and in particular to the central importance of Russia to the entire story. Special correspondent Ryan Chilcote was in Russia all week for us and knows many of the Russians named in the special counsel's 400-plus page report. Ryan has also covered Russia for decades, and he joins us tonight from his home in London. So, Ryan, hello again. It's now been over a day. Is there an official reaction from the Russian government to this report?
Yes, there is, Judy. In fact, I just got off the phone with Dmitry Peskov. He's the Russian president's spokesman. He's also got a lot of attention in the Mueller report himself. He was in 18 different sections, going all the way back to 2015 in relation to the Trump Tower project. In Moscow, the people in the Trump team were liaising with him. Look, he says it's very simple. There's nothing new, he says, in this report that changes anything. There's no evidence, he says, of collusion, no evidence of Russia's meddling. As for Russian businessmen trying to, acting as intermediaries for the Russian president, trying to establish these back-channel conversations with members of the administration, he says, yes, Russian businessmen were trying to talk to members of the new administration, but there's nothing strange about that. They were, yes, also briefing the Russian president. Nothing strange about that either. He says that's simply what business people do. Judy?
So, Mr. Peskov is also saying, we gather, that they're going through the report to determine whether they should brief President Putin. Of course, he can read it on his own, but what is the expectation? That he will read it?
I think he will read it. I think that's a fair assumption. I mean, after all, he was in the KGB. He did run Russia's intelligence services. That's exactly what you're supposed to do in intelligence and counterintelligence work, is learn what your adversary or your rival knows about you and learn how they learned it. There's an awful lot of very specific allegations or evidence in that Mueller report. Of course, he's going to want to know all of that, I would have thought. In addition to that, of course, while the Russians may feel that this might absolve President Trump of some wrongdoing, they will realize that their troubles are probably not over. There are at least a couple of bills right now in the U.S. Congress that could lead to more sanctions being imposed against Russia. So it's not just the Russian president that will be interested in reading this report. I've spoken with several Russian businessmen since the report came out, and they all start the conversation by saying to me, hey, Ryan, am I in there? Because they're concerned that they too could be sanctioned if they are in the report, and that, of course, would be bad for business.
And finally, just quickly, Ryan, as we know, this report accuses the Russians of systematically having a sweeping interference in U.S. elections. President Trump, though, is still not accusing the Russians directly. How do they read that in Moscow?
They actually mirror President Trump quite often. You'll remember when the Attorney General's summary of the Mueller report came out about a month ago, the Russians, just like President Trump, said that it absolved them, it exonerated them of any kind of responsibility. They are obviously very pleased. Remember Helsinki? I was at that press conference where President Trump and President Putin stood next to one another, and President Trump said that he believed President Putin when President Putin told him that Russia had not interfered. That said, the Russians were very concerned about what happened the next day when Congress effectively took control over the relationship between the United States and Russia. I interviewed President Putin at an energy conference at the end of last year, and I asked him what he wanted to see in terms of relations with the U.S., and he said, look, I want them to sort out this, effectively, if you will, partisan conflict. He says the Russians are simply being scapegoated. The Russians say, hey, you guys should sort this out so we can start to work on a constructive Russian-American relationship.
But again, what the report says after a 2-year investigation is that the Russians were clearly behind a sweeping interference in the elections. Ryan Chilcote reporting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.